Hello everyone, welcome to Introduction to Sociology. My name is Kathleen Adams and I'll be your instructor this semester. So we're just going to get started today talking pretty broadly about what sociology is. Some of you might be asking yourself, what's the difference between psychology and sociology? So I'll touch on that for you for a minute. Then we'll look at some kind of pivotal thinkers within the field of sociology who really kind of defined the discipline for us about 100 years ago or so, a little bit longer for some of them. And then we'll conclude by looking at something called the 3 sociological paradigms. All right, so don't get overwhelmed. Today's just an intro lecture. We'll touch on several different aspects, but a lot of this stuff we're going to come back to throughout the rest of the semester. So just take it all in, right? All right, let's get started. What is sociology? It is, here's our fancy definition, the study of groups and group interactions, societies and social interactions, from small personal groups to very large groups, like an entire nation. A people who live in a defined geographic area, who interact with one another, and who share a common culture is what sociologists call a society. So sociologists, we study all sorts of things. There are, and we'll go over this in chapter 2, all the different kind of sub-disciplines within sociology. But there are sociologists who study all sorts of things, crime and family and, divorce, love, sports, drug use, the prison system, race and ethnicity, gender and sexualities, a lot of different topics that we'll be coming back to throughout the rest of this semester. But, sociology as a field, as a discipline, is pretty much just as broad as, our social worlds are, right? People are very different. There's a whole lot of different institutions and belief systems that, affect how we live and think every day. So sociology, that's kind of what it's interested in. Anything that groups societies, from small groups to huge groups like an entire nation, how they live, how they define themselves. So we study social events, interactions, patterns, but the key thing, we'll get back to this in chapter 2, is it's a little bit more than just blogging, right, or just journalism, just observing things. The key for a sociologist is, yes, to observe, but also to really develop a theory, that you're studying societies with a purpose, to try and uncover something, some sort of truth about social worlds. So the key is to develop a theory to explain why things happen the way they do. We'll get more into that next week. Now this term sociology, it's relatively new in the grand scheme of things. The word was first coined back in 1780 by a French essayist and political philosopher named Emile Durkheim, and he had a lot of ties to the French Revolution. And we'll get into this in just a moment here, a few moments. But sociology really sprung out of, not only the French and American revolutions, but also the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of social change, right, was happening very quickly. Think, between the late 1700s and the late 1800s. In that span of 100 years, so much was changing. And all of those changes were affecting the way that groups and societies were living and interacting with each other. So we'll come back to that after we talk about the sociological imagination. So we're going to start here. This has become kind of a really fundamental introductory text for any new or aspiring sociologist to read when they're getting started. So this guy named C. Wright Mills, we're going to read something else by him later on in this semester called The Power Elite, but he's also very well known for writing his book, The Sociological Imagination. So C. Wright Mills, kind of the purpose of his book was to set forth like an argument, like why do we need sociology? What answers does sociology give us that psychology maybe can't or doesn't, or leaves open? And he also argued that if you want to be a sociologist, you have to develop what he called the sociological imagination. And for him, that meant to develop an awareness of the relationship between a person's behavior and experience and the wider culture that shaped the person's choices and perceptions. So he said, it's important to see an individual's behavior is not just happening in some sort of, microcosm, unaffected by everything else that goes on in the world. The way that we as individuals think and react and talk and act, everything about what we think we know about ourselves is in many ways constructed or affected by the society we live in and the history of that society. So, he said there are certain, cultural patterns, social forces that pressure people to live one way rather than another way. That we often, especially in the US, right, we think of ourselves as like solitary, strong individuals, and almost everything about our culture, media kind of, continuously reinforces that message to us. But that way of thinking itself is kind of a social construct. Not every society, promotes individualism the same way that ours does. And what does that say about our society? So we'll get into those discussions later on in the semester. But, in a nutshell here, the individual and society are inseparable, according to Mills and according to every sociologist. And it's really impossible to study one without taking the other into consideration. So I have a little video on Blackboard if you're interested in learning a little bit more about C. Wright Mills and this book. And the next several slides I have an excerpt from his book, from chapter 1 of Sociological Imagination, which is called The Promise. So this was written back in 1959, and probably won't read all of this for you out loud, but I'll give you some highlights as we go through here. We'll start out with the beginning though. Nowadays, people often feel that their private lives are a series of traps. They sense that within their everyday worlds, they cannot overcome their troubles, and in this feeling, they are often quite correct. What ordinary people are directly aware of and what they try to do are bounded by the private orbits in which they live. Their visions and their powers are limited to the close-up scenes of job, family, neighborhood. In other milieux, they move vicariously and remain spectators. And the more aware they become, however vaguely, of ambitions and of threats which transcend their immediate locales, the more trapped they seem to feel. Underlying this sense of being trapped are seemingly impersonal changes in the very structure of continent-wide societies. The facts of contemporary history are also, I want to highlight this sentence, are also facts about the success and the failure of individual men and women. This is a key paragraph right here, right? And see how he's making comparisons here between, when something huge, when something, structural, systemic happens in society, what are the repercussions on us as members of that society? So here we go. When a society is industrialized, a peasant becomes a worker. A feudal lord is liquidated or becomes a businessman. When classes rise or fall, a person is employed or unemployed. When the rate of investment goes up or down, a person takes a new cart or goes broke. When wars happen, an insurance salesperson becomes a rocket launcher. A store clerk, a radio operator. A wife or husband lives alone. A child grows up without a parent. Neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And we continue. Yet people do not usually define the troubles they endure in terms of historical change and institutional contradiction. The well-being they enjoy, they do not usually impute to the big ups and downs of the societies in which they live. Seldom aware of the intricate connection between the patterns of their own lives and the course of world history, ordinary people do not usually know what this connection means for the kinds of people they are becoming and for the kinds of history making in which they might take part. They do not possess the quality of mind essential to grasp the interplay of individuals and society, of biography and history, of self and world. They cannot cope with their personal troubles in such ways as to control the structural transformations that usually lie behind them. All right, let's see. Yeah, we can read this part. Surely it is no wonder in what period have so many people been so totally exposed at so fast a pace to such earthquakes of change. That Americans have not known such catastrophic changes as have the men and women of other societies is due to the historical facts that are now quickly becoming merely history. The history that now affects every individual is world history. Within this scene and this period, in the course of a single generation, 1/6 of humankind is transformed from all that is feudal and backward into all that is modern, advanced, and fearful. Political colonies are freed. New and less visible forms of imperialism installed. Revolutions occur. People feel the intimate grip of new kinds of authority. Totalitarian societies rise and are smashed to bits or succeed fabulously. After 2 centuries of ascendancy, capitalism is shown up as only one way to make society into an industrial apparatus. After 2 centuries of hope, even formal democracy is restricted to a quite small portion of mankind. Everywhere in the underdeveloped world, ancient ways of life are broken up and vague expectations become urgent demands. Everywhere in the overdeveloped world, the means of authority and of violence become total in scope and bureaucratic in form. Humanity itself now lies before us, the supernation at either pole concentrating its most coordinated and massive efforts upon the preparation of World War III. Remember that last sentence, he's writing in the 1950s, in the middle of the Cold War, right, between the USSR and the US. Onward, the very shaping of history now outpaces the ability of people to orient themselves in accordance with cherished values. And which values? Even when they do not panic, people often sense that the older ways of feeling and thinking have collapsed and that newer beginnings are ambiguous to the point of moral stasis. Is it any wonder that ordinary people feel they cannot cope with the larger worlds with which they are so suddenly confronted? that they cannot understand the meaning of their epoch for their lives, that, in defense of selfhood, they become morally insensible, trying to remain altogether private individuals, is it any wonder that they come to be possessed by a sense of the trap? It is not only information that they need. In this age of fact, information often dominates their attention and overwhelms their capacities to assimilate it. It is not only the skills of reason that they need, although their struggles to acquire these often exhaust their limited moral energy. What they need, what they feel they need, is a quality of mind that will help them to use information and to develop reason in order to achieve lucid summations of what is going on in the world and of what may be happening within themselves. It is this quality, I am going to contend, that journalists and scholars, artists and publics, scientists and editors are coming to expect of what may be called the sociological imagination. The sociological imagination enables its possessor to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. It enables him to take into account how individuals, in the welter of their daily experience, often become falsely conscious of their social positions. Within that welter, the framework of modern society is sought, and within that framework, the psychologies of a variety of men and women are formulated. By such means, the personal uneasiness of individuals is focused upon explicit troubles, and the indifference of publics is transformed into the involvement with public issues. The first fruit of this imagination, and the first lesson of the social science that embodies it, is the idea that the individual can understand her own experience and gauge her own fate only by locating within her period, that she can know her own chances in life only by becoming aware of those of all individuals in her circumstances. In many ways, it is a terrible lesson. In many ways, a magnificent one. We do not know the limits of humans' capacities for supreme effort or willing degradation, for agony or glee, for pleasurable brutality, or the sweetness of reason. But in our time, we have come to know that the limits of human nature, quote unquote, are frighteningly broad. We have come to know that every individual lives, from one generation to the next, in some society, that he lives out a biography, and he lives it out within some historical sequence. By the fact of this living, he contributes, however minutely, to the shaping of the society and to the course of its history, even as he is made by society and by its historical push and shove. Let's get that top paragraph. We'll start down here. No social study that does not come back to the problems of biography, of history, and of their intersections within a society has completed its intellectual journey. Whatever the specific problems of the classic social analysts, however limited or however broad the features of social reality they have examined, those who have been imaginatively aware of the promise of their work have consistently asked three sorts of questions. Number one, what is the structure of this particular society? What are its essential components? How are they related to one another? How does it differ from other varieties of social order? Within it, what is the meaning of any particular feature for its continuance and for its change? Number two, where does a society stand in human history? What are the mechanics by which it's changing? What is its place within and its meaning for the development of humanity as a whole? And how does any particular feature we are examining affect, and how is it affected by, the historical period in which it moves? And this period, what are its essential features? How does it differ from other periods? What are its characteristic ways of history making? And number 3, what varieties of men and women now prevail in this society and in this period? And what varieties are coming to prevail? In what ways are they selected and formed, liberated and repressed, made sensitive and blunted? What kind of human nature are revealed in the conduct and character we observe in this society in this period? And what is the meaning for human nature of each and every feature of the society we are examining? There we go. Whether the point of interest is a great power state or a minor literary mood, a family, a prison, a creed, these are the kinds of questions the best social analysts have asked. They are the intellectual pivots of classic studies of individuals in society, and they are the questions inevitably raised by any mind possessing the sociological imagination. For this imagination is the capacity to shift from one perspective to another, from the political to the psychological, from examination of a single family to comparative assessment of the national budgets of the world, from the theological school of the military establishment, from considerations of an oil industry to studies of contemporary poetry. It's the capacity to range from the most impersonal and remote transformations to the most intimate features of the human self, and to see the relations between the two. Back of its use, there's always the urge to know the social and historical meaning of the individual in the society and in the period in which she has her quality and her being. That, in brief, is why it is by means of the sociological imagination that men and women now hope to grasp what is going on in the world and to understand what is happening in themselves as minute points of the intersections of biography and history within society. In large part, contemporary humanity's self-conscious view of itself as at least an outsider, if not a permanent stranger, rests upon an absorbed realization of social relativity and of the transformative power of history. The sociological imagination is the most fruitful form of this self-consciousness. By its use, people whose mentalities have swept only a series of limited orbits often come to feel as if suddenly awakened in a house with which they had only supposed themselves to be familiar. Correctly or incorrectly, they often come to feel that they can now provide themselves with adequate summations, cohesive assessments, comprehensive orientations. Older decisions that once appeared sound now seem to them products of a mind unaccountably dense. Their capacity for astonishment is made lively again. They acquire a new way of thinking. They experience a transvaluation of values. In a word, by their reflection and by their sensibility, they realize the cultural meaning of the social sciences. Perhaps the most fruitful distinction with which the sociological imagination works is between personal troubles of milieu and the public issues of social structure. This distinction is an essential tool of the sociological imagination and a feature of all classic work in social science. So this slide right here has got your key material. So we've got the difference between personal troubles and social issues. Let's see what Mills has to say. All right, we've got troubles occur within the individual, give the character of the individual, and within the range of his or her immediate relations with others. They have to do with oneself and with those limited areas of social life in which one is directly and personally aware. Accordingly, the statement and the resolution of troubles properly lie within the individual as a biographical entity. and within the scope of one's immediate milieu, this social setting that is directly open to his or her personal experience and to some extent willful activity. A trouble is a private matter. Values cherished by the individual are felt by her to be threatened. Issues, on the other hand, have to do with matters that transcend these local environments and of the individual and the range of her inner life. They have to do with the organization of many such milieu into the institutions of a historical society as a whole, with the ways in which various milieu overlap and interpenetrate to form the larger structure of social and historical life. An issue is a public matter. Some value cherished by publics is felt to be threatened. Often there is a debate about what that value really is and about what it is that really threatens it. This debate is often without focus, if only because it is the very nature of an issue, unlike even widespread trouble, that it cannot very well be defined in terms of the immediate and everyday environments of ordinary people. An issue, in fact, often involves a crisis in institutional arrangements. And now he kind of gives you some examples to make more sense of like what does he mean between the difference between a personal trouble and a social issue. So this first example up here, up on the top, we got in these terms, consider unemployment. When in a city of 100,000, only one is unemployed, that's his personal trouble. For its relief, we properly look to the character of the individual, his skills, his immediate opportunity. But when in a nation of 50 million employees, 15 million are unemployed, that's an issue. And we may not hope to find its solution within the range of opportunities open to any one individual. The very structure of opportunities has collapsed. Both the correct statement of the problem and the range of possible solutions require us to consider the economic and political institutions of the society, and not merely the personal situation and character of a scatter of individuals. Consider war. The personal problem of war, when it occurs, may be how to survive in it, or how to die in it with honor, how to make money out of it, how to climb into the higher safety of the military apparatus, how to contribute to the war's termination. In short, according to one's values, to find a set of milieu and within it to survive the war and to make one's death in it meaningful. But the structural issues of war have to do with its causes, with what types of people it throws up into command, with its effects upon economic and political, family and religious institutions, with the unorganized irresponsibility of a world of nation states. Consider marriage. Inside a marriage, a man and a woman may experience personal troubles, but when the divorce rate during the first 4 years of marriage is 250 out of every 1,000 attempts, this is an indication of a structural issue having to do with the institutions of marriage and the family and other institutions that bear upon them. And then we're getting close to the end of this excerpt here. Insofar as an economy is so arranged that slumps occur, the problem of unemployment becomes incapable of personal solution. Insofar as war is inherent in the nation-state system and in the uneven industrialization of the world, the ordinary individual in his or her restricted milieu will be powerless, with or without psychiatric aid, to solve the troubles the system or lack of system imposes upon him. All right. Insofar as the family as an institution turns women into darling little slaves, and men into their chief providers and unweaned dependents, the problem of a satisfactory marriage remains incapable of purely private solution. Insofar as the overdeveloped megalopolis, a big city, and the overdeveloped automobile are built-in features of the overdeveloped society, the issues of urban living will not be solved by personal ingenuity and private wealth. What we experience in various and specific milieu is often caused by structural changes. Accordingly, to understand the changes of many personal milieu, we are required to look beyond them. And the number and variety of such structural changes increase as the institutions within which we live become more embracing and more intricately connected with one another. To be aware of the idea of social structure and to use it with sensibility is to be capable of tracing such linkages among a great variety of milieu. To be able to do that is to possess the sociological imagination. So there you have it, a little fundamental text for you. And you can go back and read that in more detail. I've got a PDF in Blackboard, or you have this PowerPoint PDF attached as well. So that kind of just gets us started. So the main thing that he says in there is like the difference between troubles and issues, right? And that also gets to this question of what's the difference between psychology and sociology? Psychology, tends to, at least classic psychology, kind of tended to focus solely on the individual and their personal experiences. If a person was depressed, a psychologist might look to your family history. Was your mother mean to you when you were 3 years old? Or did your father drop you down a flight of stairs accidentally when you were a baby, etc. Right? These kind of like personal histories that might explain why we are who we are. Or a psychologist might look, study your brain and the brain functioning, and if you have enough of serotonin going on, and maybe if we give you this drug, it will improve that, and we can cure you of your depression. So the main thing I'm trying to say is, psychology, at least classic psychology, tended to really hone in on, the individual. Sociology doesn't take the individual for granted. Like, yes, we're not all a bunch of little like automatons. We all have our own brains, and we think, and we have our own histories and families and friends and experiences that have shaped who we are. But all of those experiences have been constructed within some sort of social world, right? I mean, we weren't raised in a vacuum, Each of us was raised within a certain social context, certain religious context, certain economic context, racial context, gendered context. And all of the lessons that we've learned via all of these social experiences have made us who we are today. So even though we are individuals, and we have our own brains and we can think for ourselves, to what extent, sociologists might ask, is the way we think for ourselves really independent of the society we live in and the society that raised us? So that's one question to think about, and we'll come back to that over and over again. But now onward, let's get into the historical context for the emergence of sociology. So I kind of mentioned earlier, right, that sociology, the term, was first coined by that French political philosopher Sieyès back in 1780. But sociology as a discipline really got kicked off kind of closer to like the mid-late 1800s. And the reason sociology came about was it was kind of in the midst of all of this immense uh, industrial change, political change, economic change that was happening um, in specific countries, and eventually started to spread around the world. So the founders of sociology, who we're going to look at in a minute, were all really inspired by all these monumental social changes that were being brought about because of all of these like revolutions, political revolutions, the Industrial Revolution specifically. So I have a little video on Blackboard if you want to kind of refresh your memory of what the Industrial Revolution is, and all the different kind of changes that were going on at the time. Now, often, when you learn in history class about the Industrial Revolution, you might be learning about, the inventions and, the rise of capitalism and factories and all that. But when you watch this video, or when you're thinking about this time around, try and really don't think so much about the inventions and all that and the factories, but think about the changes if you were living at that point in time in history, which really, again, in the grand scheme of things, wasn't that long ago. How would that have affected you? How were people living before that era? And how did people live, 50 years after, into the Industrial Revolution? There were some pretty huge changes going on in societies, in all these industrial, countries. So I'll put a few highlights of what's going on that brought about, this field of sociology. And a lot of this, going on during the 18th and the 19th centuries, so the 1700s and the 1800s. So right in the 1700s, we have the American and the French revolutions with a big, rejection of monarchies and the creation of democratic republics. So a pretty monumental change when it comes to our political institutions at the time. This kind of the overthrowing of this idea that kings and queens can make decisions on behalf of the people, and the substitution of that form of governance with, a more democratic form of governance, one where the people had say in who their representatives were and what the laws would be and how their taxes would be spent. Another thing going on during this time was the publication of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. So kind of the rise of capitalism, more widespread capitalism, the rise of wage labor and factory work. So, capitalism kind of took hold for many, centuries. Kind of most relations in terms of economics were kind of defined by feudalism, and monarchies. But those kind of systems, social systems, kind of lost sway, and capitalism and democracy, right, started to take hold. There was also a shift during this time from most people living in rural, agrarian, kind of farming environments, and that kind of slow-paced, self-sustainable way of life, to moving into, they had to move where the factories were. So all these people were moving into these new urban centers, these big cities, where all this industrial life was going on, which also brought with it, a whole lot of not so great things, we'll get to. So people were moving from these really small, close-knit towns. They were, they had their own farms, they could feed themselves, they could sustain themselves, and moving into these new highly developed industrial cities in order to go to work for a wage in the factories. Most people before that time, like the concept of a wage, an hourly wage or a daily wage, was like completely foreign. Of course, in these new cities, not everything was great. Working conditions back then in the factories were pretty brutal. Um, the kind of labor laws that we have today, a 40-hour work week and OSHA labor protections, minimum wages, child labor laws, none of those things existed back then. So it was a pretty brutal and filthy environment to work and to live in. Um, and, speaking of that, living conditions weren't so great either. Most workers, were living in these really small, crowded housing or apartment buildings. There was a lot of things that hadn't been developed yet. There was not really any like centralized sanitation system. People were throwing their feces and their urine out into the streets. Medicine was, only really starting to get developed at this time, and certainly wasn't, widespread available yet. There was overcrowding in the streets, in housing, everywhere, in the factories, that led to really rampant spreading of sickness and diseases. Pollution from all these factories was everywhere. It was pouring into the streams, into the lakes, in the streets, in the air. And then we've got, all those inventions I talked about, right, during the industrial and the agricultural revolutions. And just to name a few, and just think, like, yes, all these inventions happened, but, over the course of 150, 200 years, all of these inventions were popping up. And think of what that would do to your society, to the way that you communicated and interacted, and the way you thought of yourself within the greater society, and all that change that's going on. So, just a few: the steam engine, steamboats, the railroad, the cotton gin, vaccines, dynamite, the light bulb, printing press, the telegraph, the telephone, the plow, mechanical seeders, the combine harvester, revolving machine guns, the typewriter, the sewing machine, motion pictures, automobiles, radio, pasteurization, and refrigeration. People were now working and producing products and food more quickly and efficiently than ever before. We could travel faster. We could interact with more people than we ever had been able to. And we could communicate relatively instantly. So sociology as a discipline, right, kind of comes out of all of these different transformations that are happening in kind of this, 150-year period. Certain scholars, historians were sitting around and concerned that all of these changes, political, economic, industrial, technological, economic, all of these changes were affecting society in really profound ways. And so people, certain scholars who we're about to get into, decided to sit down and commit their lives to trying to understand what was happening to society during this period, and as a result of all of these transformations. So, the daily lives of people who were living in the early 1700s and the daily lives of people living in the late 1800s were dramatically different. There were new ways of living, creating, eating, surviving, knowing, and thinking. So we're going to look at the next few slides at kind of a few people who are considered kind of the founders of sociology. And they wanted to understand what our new modern societies were going to be like. And a lot of them were worried about the weakening of social ties that seemed to be occurring as a result of all of these transformations. So here are our 6 founders of sociology that we're going to look at this week. We'll come back to several of them in future chapters. We'll come back to Marx, Durkheim, and Weber in a lot of detail in chapter 4. Come back to George Herbert Mead as well, and Harriet Martineau. Comte, we're just going to look at in this chapter. Probably won't come back to him too much. So let's look at all 6 of these founders. So first we have Auguste Comte. He was living from 1798 to 1857. And I have a couple key quotes for him. First quote, "Positivism is a theory of knowledge according to which the only kind of sound knowledge available to humankind is that of science grounded in observation." And the second quote, "Know yourself to improve yourself." So you may have noticed on that last slide that longer quote about positivism. What is that? So Auguste Comte is known as really kind of like the founder of sociology. He really set forth kind of a vision for what he wanted sociology to look like and social research to look like. And he actually, originally, he didn't want it to be called sociology. He wanted it to be called social physics. Of course, today we call it sociology. But for him, the emphasis is on making sociology into a science, right? And like any new discipline that gets introduced, the other established disciplines, kind of look down on it. And so Comte was really concerned with kind of making sociology into a respected, reputable discipline that could hold its own alongside psychology, but also other sciences like biology and astronomy and chemistry, medicine, zoology, and botany. So he was really obsessed with, how can we make sociology a respectable field of knowledge and science? And his answer was what he called positivism, which for him was essentially, putting this really strong emphasis on striving for scientific objectivity and predictability. So he felt that sociology, if it wanted to be, taken seriously, it needed to kind of mimic the same scientific methods that the natural sciences used. And so, just like the natural sciences, he felt that all social research, anything that comes out of a sociologist's, studies, needs to be grounded in objective data. And that means things that can be measured, things that can be proven, right? Not just thoughts in our head or our own interpretations, but things that can be measured, data that can be analyzed and proven to other people. So by using the scientific method, social scientists can test and prove or disprove hypotheses so that they can identify laws of society. So, right, all these sciencey words in here indicate a very positivist type of research, following the scientific method, coming up with hypotheses, determining variables, your independent and dependent variables, and the whole point of that is to, prove laws or theories of society. In the same way that, you might see in the natural sciences. So because of this emphasis on positivism, there's a big emphasis on quantitative sociology. Quantitative means, having to do with numbers. So using analysis of data, usually numerical data, like you see in this little picture over here, statistical models derived from surveys with large numbers of participants. So anytime that you see a sociologist putting a big emphasis on numbers, on data analysis, statistics, graphs, charts, and they're talking about hypotheses and variables or experiments, think positivism. That sociologist is a positivist sociologist. And the kind of goal here was, if we can identify laws of society through all of this objective data analysis, social scientists could further identify ways to manipulate the social laws or formulas so that they could help to solve social problems like poverty or corruption. All right, so that was kind of the founding of sociology. Comte kind of just set forth and said, this needs to be a new discipline. This is how the discipline should look. This is how the research should be done. Now, a little bit later, we have Harriet Martineau starting to write. And she, let's start with a couple key quotes from her. Number 1, if a test of civilization be sought, none can be so sure as the condition of that half of society over which the other half has power. So she writes a lot about gender relations during her time period. Second quote, during the present interval between the feudal age and the coming time, when life and its occupations will be freely thrown open to women as to men, the condition of the female working classes is such that if its sufferings were but made known, emotions of horror and shame would tremble through the whole of society. So Harriet Martineau she's well known for a number of books that she wrote, but she's also very well known for kind of spreading Auguste Comte's writings. So she was the first person to translate Comte's writings from French to English, which then started to, get this word out about, sociology in this new field. She is known as the first woman sociologist. And she was very well known for performing the first systematic international comparison of social institutions. So one of her books here is Retrospective Western Travel. And she wrote, so she was kind of like a travel writer / sociologist. She, actually came to the U.S. Again, kind of in the early mid 1800s, and she kind of wrote her observations, what she was seeing. She would talk to the women in the United States, and she also talked to as many slaves and slave owners at the time across our country. And she wrote her observations in a book, and she had another book where she traveled into Middle Eastern countries and was studying like the harems of the Middle East and the way that women were perceived and treated in the harems. So she's kind of studying and comparing different gender relations, comparing the institution of slavery with what she was used to in a country that didn't really have institutionalized slavery. So that is really kind of what she's best known for. She also believes sociologists should not just observe, but produce solutions that benefit societies. So she actually especially after talking and seeing slavery in the U.S., she became a pretty passionate, abolitionist, and made a lot of enemies doing that as well across the South. But she also argued that sociologists should keep religious, political, and economic institutions always in mind. She also, if those quotes on the last slide didn't tell you this already, she said there is a big importance for sociologists to maintain a focus not just on men's lives, but also on women's lives. And she also advocated for paying more attention to social practices like marriage, child rearing, domestic life, and religious life. Now, our third person that we're going to look into today is Karl Marx. Maybe you've heard of this guy, or maybe you've heard of Marxism at least. So Marx is considered a sociologist. So a couple of quotes from him. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Free man and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. And second quote, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. Now we're going to come back to Marx in a lot more detail in chapter 4. So I'm just going to give you a little primer here. But back in 1848, he's most well known probably for co-publishing with Friedrich Engels the Communist Manifesto, which was kind of inspired by kind of the working conditions of and after the Industrial Revolution, all this factory work and wage labor, the way that workers were being treated in those factories, and not really compensated very well, the filth of the cities, all that stuff I touched on several slides ago. Really inspired him and Engels to write the Communist Manifesto. Marx rejected Comte's positivism. So just because Comte said sociologists should all be positivists does not mean all sociologists have agreed with that, as we'll see, especially next week, more so in chapter 2. And he believed, as maybe that quote on the last slide told you, that the entire history of social progress can be boiled down to a series of class struggles, conflicts between different social classes. And during kind of his time period, he said the main struggle, the main conflict of classes was between the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, the ownership class, the managerial class, versus the proletariat, the working class, the everyman. And that struggle was over what he called the means of production, which is anything you need to produce. But we'll get more into those terms in chapter 4. So what's most important to kind of keep in mind here is, Marx's social theory, this kind of perspective of class conflict and struggle, and how that defines history and progress, inspired what we're going to refer to throughout this class as conflict theory, which is this idea that social conflict leads to changes in society. We'll come back to that in a little bit here. All right, now we have Emile Durkheim. So Durkheim was actually a student of Auguste Comte's. So he was a positivist, which we'll come back to on the next slide. But a couple quotes by him first. Society is not a mere sum of individuals. Rather, the system formed by their association represents a specific reality which has its own characteristics. The group thinks, feels, and acts quite differently from the way in which its members would were they isolated. If, then, we begin with the individual, we shall be able to understand nothing of what takes place in the group. And second quote, things perceived as real become real in their consequences. Now, like I said, Durkheim was a student of Auguste Comte, and he really helped to make sociology a formal discipline. Comte kind of, set the stage. He put a roadmap out there. But he was a teacher, and it's really his students who kind of made sociology happen. So Durkheim actually opened the first European department of sociology in 1895. And because he was Comte's student, makes sense, he was also a positivist. So a big emphasis on making sociology into a reputable science. We're going to come back to Durkheim a lot more in chapter 4 as well. So I'm going to go over these terms here really quickly, but if you don't completely grasp them, that's okay. We'll come back in more detail in chapter 4. But for Durkheim, his primary goal was to create a science of social facts. And he said that social facts were objective and measurable data about a society. So things like laws, morals, values, religious beliefs, customs, fashions, rituals, anything that serves to govern our social life, he called a social fact. And he said all of the social facts combined in a society create what he called the collective conscious. And for Durkheim, all of us as individuals are constrained by the collective conscious. We can't even think outside of it. It has, we've been socialized into the collective conscious since we were little babies. So for Durkheim, there actually is no such thing as an individual. All of our individual, quote unquote, ideas and beliefs are derived from this collective conscious, from this social order. And he kind of compares the collective conscious to like the air that we breathe. Just like, as we live on this earth, we don't really have a choice into whether we want to breathe or not, right? If we don't breathe, we die. And in the same way, for Durkheim, we don't have a choice as to whether or not the collective conscious affects us. It just is. And we are who we are because of it. All right, number 5, got 2 more. George Herbert Mead. So he's writing a little bit later than all of these other people we're looking at. But Mead kind of took a different spin on sociology, and he's actually more known as, and we'll talk a lot more about this kind of type of sociology later in the class, but he's known as kind of like a social psychologist. So, sometime in like the early 1900s, psychologists and sociologists started to realize, hey, maybe, are the ways that we're both studying a lot of these social issues, maybe we're kind of complementary. Maybe we can help each other. Maybe we can balance each other. So this kind of new field started to spring up in the early 1900s that we call, social psychology today. But anyway, we'll get back to that. George Herbert Mead, a couple quotes from him. A multiple personality is, in a certain sense, normal. And second quote, man lives in a world of meaning. So George Herbert Mead was much more focused on micro-level relationships and qualitative analysis. So not quantitative like positivism, right? He's more interested in qualitative analysis. He studied the concept of the self, of the individual, and how the self or the individual is shaped by social processes. So he said how we define ourself is relational, it's in flux, it's always changing, depending on what audience we are imagining ourselves, quote unquote, performing for. So for him, who we are as an individual is always shifting depending on what social group we are in at any given time. So think, when you're with your family, you probably show a certain side of yourself. Maybe a little bit of a different self than you show when you're with your closest, best, your best friends from school. And then maybe if you go to church or are part of any religious organization, another side of yourself maybe comes out when you're with those people. That's kind of what he focused on, how our self, our individual selfhood is not always, it's always kind of changing. It's always in flux, right? Depending on who we're with. So in that way, who we are as an individual is very much determined by what society, we're in, what social group we're in. So he argued that the way that people come to view themselves is based to a large extent on our interactions with other people. Again, we'll come back to Mead in a later chapter in more detail. And lastly here, Weber, who we will also come back to in more detail in chapter 4. Here's a couple quotes from Max Weber. All knowledge of cultural reality, as may be seen, is always knowledge from particular points of view. Second quote, certainly all historical experience confirms the truth that man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. Now, Weber was also an anti-positivist, so he did not particularly agree with the way that Comte and Durkheim wanted sociology to look. He claimed that positivism and striving for objectivity about societies through some sort of scientific analysis of data was impossible. Instead, he believed that researchers and sociologists should strive for subjectivity, to try to understand social worlds, social processes, norms, values from an insider point of view. So the aim of sociology for him is not to come up with these laws of society that can be manipulated. The aim should be to systematically gain an in-depth understanding of different societies. And he wanted sociologists to utilize this word, a little German word for you called Verstehen, and that means when an outside observer of a society attempts to understand it from the insider's point of view. Right? So really trying to put yourself into someone else's shoes, metaphorically. Not to judge it from an objective outsider science-y perspective, but to really try to see the world from someone else's point of view. And so Weber also, had an emphasis more on qualitative data, not a lot of statistics and numbers and all that, but more of an interest in understanding human behavior by learning about it through, in-depth interviews, focus groups, content analysis, really trying to understand societies and the way that they interpret their own social worlds from that inside point of view. So that's just a little overview of why sociology, what is sociology, the sociological imagination, the historical context for why sociology emerged when it did. And then we just looked at, kind of those 6 founders of sociology, many of which we're going to come back to in a lot more detail, but just to give you an idea of, the fact that all sociologists don't agree on everything, right? Hopefully you're at least getting that idea so far. And on that note, we're going to kind of end with the 3 theoretical paradigms that will continue to pop up throughout this class in this semester. So we're going to look at something called structural functionalism. Going to look at conflict theory, which I already kind of mentioned with Marx, if you remember. Then lastly, we'll look at symbolic interactionist theory. So you might be sitting there like, what the heck is a theoretical paradigm? So don't let that word paradigm, stress you out. A paradigm is just kind of a point of view. It's a philosophical and theoretical framework used within a discipline to formulate theories, generalizations, and the experiments performed in support of them. In a nutshell, just think of a paradigm as like a different pair of sunglasses, right? Each with different color lenses. And so each of these 3 paradigms that we're going to look at kind of represents a different way of thinking and perceiving the world sociologically. You don't have to choose one of them, and stick with it. No one paradigm is 100% right. Some of them, they all have their strengths and their weaknesses, depending on what social issue we're looking at. Some of them might make more sense to you than others. But by looking at all 3 of these perspectives throughout the semester, it'll give us a more kind of clear, comprehensive view of each social issue that we're going to be looking at. So, really quick kind of overview of each of these. There's a little video if you want to get more in depth in these paradigms. I posted on Blackboard for you. But here's our first one. We've got structural functionalism. So this perspective, this paradigm, kind of interprets society as a structure, structural functionalism, with interrelated parts designed to meet the biological and social needs of individuals in that society. So what does that mean? Basically, kind of think of this metaphor. Look at this picture over here, right? The human body. Society is like a human body. Just like all of our organs work together, to keep us alive, to keep our body functioning and healthy. In the same way, the institutions of society have to work together in harmony to keep society functioning and healthy. So structural functionalists put a big emphasis on the institutions of society as kind of like the lifeblood of societies. And if you have weak institutions, then you have a weak society. If you have strong institutions, you have a strong society and a healthy society. So you might be wondering, what the heck is an institution? Well, there's all sorts of them. We'll come back to this a lot more in future chapters as well. But things like the economy, that's an institution. Our education system, the government, the family, our religion. Those are some really major institutions in our society. And so a structural functionalist would be very focused on all of these institutions of society and making sure they are strong and healthy and communicating common values, norms, and symbols to everyone in society. Because if they're not, well, then society is not healthy and it needs to be repaired. It's dysfunctional, right? So social processes that have undesirable consequences for the operation of society are called dysfunctions, and they must be fixed if we want society to continue to survive. All right, so that's structural functionalism in a nutshell. It might be confusing to you right now, but we're going to come back to these paradigms in just about every chapter in this during this semester. And once we start kind of like illustrating what these mean, like in application, when we talk about certain social issues, it'll make more sense to you, I promise. But structural functionalism, just remember the kind of this body metaphor, the same way that our organs, pump blood through our body and keep us alive, and everything's interconnected and keeps us healthy and breathing. This same way that happens in our body, the institutions of society are kind of like the organs in our society, and they have to be super healthy and pumping the blood, the metaphorical values of society through us in order for society to be healthy and functional. Second paradigm that we're going to come back to over and over again this semester is called conflict theory. So I kind of touched on conflict theory when I talked about Karl Marx. But essentially, conflict theory says that society is a competition for limited resources, and that conflict over resources is the driver of history and the progress of civilizations. Social conflict leads to change in society. So for Marx, he was mostly focused on the fact that society was made up of different economic classes competing for social, political, and material resources. But since the days of Marx, more recently, conflict theory has kind of blossomed beyond just being about economic classes, though some sociologists still kind of focus on that. But conflict theory also today kind of applies when we talk about like race and ethnicity, or gender, or sexuality, or aging. And we'll come back to what that all means throughout the rest of the semester. And the last slide for you here, and our third paradigm is symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism takes a very kind of different view of society. If you remember George Herbert Mead from a few slides ago, he would be considered a symbolic interactionist. He was, so that means these kind of sociologists are more interested in what we call like micro level analysis or theory, where we're not necessarily trying to make laws of society or explaining how entire societies change through conflict, but instead we're focusing more on like intimate relationships among individuals within a society. We're using qualitative research methods, not quantitative. We're focused on communication and the importance of communication in our social interactions. The importance of exchanging meaning through symbols. And there's a big focus on understanding how people make sense of their own social world. So this paradigm kind of puts a lot more power in the hands of individuals. It sees individuals as being active in shaping their social world through the power of our personal interpretation. And so in this kind of sociology, you'll see a lot of like smaller group kind of analysis, one-on-one interactions being studied. They'll kind of look for patterns of interaction between different small groups or individuals. And we talked about positivism with Comte, right? Well, the opposite of positivism is known as constructivism, which is, in a nutshell, means reality is what humans cognitively construct it to be. And we will come back to the difference between positivism and constructivism in more detail in chapter 2. So I'm just kind of throwing that term at you here at the end of chapter 1, just to get you thinking about kind of how that might contrast with positivism. So that brings us to the end of chapter 1. Pretty broad little overview for you. Again, we'll come back to a lot of this information and these theorists and these paradigms throughout the course of the semester. But hopefully you have a pretty good understanding of what we're going to be talking about throughout this course, different perspectives we're going to be considering, right? And the importance of the sociological imagination throughout all of this. So I hope you all have enjoyed kind of this little intro and you're looking forward to the semester as much as I am. Please reach out to me if you have any questions, concerns as we get started out here. And I hope you all have a great first week of classes and have a wonderful day. I will see you back here next time.